Hello, I'm Sally Bliumis-Dunn and welcome to Poetry Break. We're very fortunate today excuse me, to have as our guest Suzanne Cleary. Suzanne has published 2 books of poetry. The first is Keeping Time, the second is Trick Pear, both of which were published by Carnegie Mellon. Wonderful books to read. Suzanne has won a Pushcart Prize, the Cecil Hemley Memorial Award from the Poetry Society of America. She's had residencies at MacDowell and Yaddo, and her poems appear in several anthologies: Poetry 180, 180 More, Poetry, The Atlantic Monthly, the London Daily Telegraph, and her book reviews appear in the Bloomsbury Review. We're very lucky to have her here. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I wanted to ask you, when did you start writing poetry, and what was it in your life that caused that to be something you wanted to do?
I am someone who hated poetry throughout elementary school and through most of high school, but my last year in high school I took a poetry workshop just because it fit into my schedule. You know, great academic tradition, I guess, and I had the assignment of writing a poem, and I wrote a poem, and as soon as I started reading contemporary poetry, I became hooked, and I fell in love with it, in short.
Yeah. So what do you think that poetry does for the reader that prose can't? What does poetry do?
Well, it's hard for me to think of it in terms of prose not doing the same thing, but I know that for me as a reader, poetry, it opens up an interior space. I think it welcomes me to a place of silence, or maybe a place of great racket and questions, but it's about the interior as opposed to the exterior world, and I think it's extremely important for that. I think prose probably does that, but there's a bit more of a meditative experience, I think, to reading a poem than rather reading a novel.
I think so. A certain intensity that poetry brings, simply by virtue of the fact that it's shorter and the words on the page way more almost than in a novel, I think. I wanted to ask you to start by reading one of my favorite poems of yours, Anyways. Maybe tell us a little bit about it, give it a little frame.
Okay, this poem is about Binghamton, New York, my hometown, and specifically it's about an expression that we use in Binghamton. The poem is dedicated to my husband, David, for reasons that will become apparent, and I think that's all I need to say about it. Anyways. Anyone born anywhere near my hometown says it this way, with an S on the end. The lake is cold, but I swim in it anyways. Kielbasa gives me heartburn, but I eat it anyways. She, he treats me bad, but I love her, him anyways. Even after we have left that place and long settled elsewhere, this is how we say it, plural. I never once, not once, thought twice about it, until my husband, a man from far away, leaned toward me one day during our courtship. His gray-green eyes, which always sparkle, doubly sparkling over our candlelit meal. Anyway, he said. And when he saw that I didn't understand, he repeated the word. Anyway, way, not ways. Corner of napkin to corner of lip, he waited. I kept him waiting. I knew he was right, but I kept him waiting anyways. In league still with me and mine. Slovaks, homesick for the old country their whole lives, who dug gardens anyways, and deep hard water wells. I looked into his eyes, their smoky constellations, and then I told him, it is anyways, plural, because the word must be large enough to hold all of our reasons. Anyways is our way of saying there is more than one reason, and there is that which is beyond reason, that which cannot be said. A man dies and his widow keeps his shirts. They are big, but she wears them anyways. The shoemaker loses his life savings in the Great Depression, but gets out of bed every day anyways. We are shy, my people, not given to storytelling. We end our stories too soon, trailing off anyways. The carpenter sighs, I didn't need that finger anyways. The beauty school student sighs, it'll grow back anyways. Our faith is weak, but we go to church anyways. The priest at St. Cyril's says God loves us. We hear what isn't said. This is what he must know about me, this man, my love. My people live in the third rainiest city in the country, but we pack our picnic baskets as the sky darkens. We fall in love, knowing it may not last, but we fall. This is how we know home. Someone who will look into our eyes and say what could ruin everything, but say it regardless.
I love that poem. And I love how David becomes the home in the end of the poem.
Yes, I think he does. I hope he does.
Yeah, I love that. In reading, I mean, you've read in lots of places and you have 2 books out now. Have you found that certain poems of yours have had an impact on people? Or are there certain poems of yours that you feel people have come up to you after a reading and said, you know, that poem really meant something to me, that surprised you in some way? And is there a poem like that for you that you would sort of land on and say, you know, this is a poem that people have gravitated towards? I'm just curious.
You know, I think that Anyways is one of those poems.
One of those, yeah.
And in fact, it's always very sweet that when people speak to me about my poems, very often they will, you know, I can see them working to include the word anyways into the conversation, you know, and I think they appreciate the humor of the poem.
Absolutely.
And I think they also feel that they understand in their own lives that there are certain ways we have of speaking to the people who grew up where we grow up, or maybe certain ways of speaking in our family, and that language is something that really binds us together. And I think that's probably part of the reason why Anyways has gotten a very nice reception in the world.
Yeah, I think so. I'm thinking of a book called Lost in Translation by Eva Hoffman. Do you know it? And she's Polish, and she comes to this country, and she talks about the word teapot and how language is empty for her because she's just come to a new country, and so none of the words have their history. And, you know, Anyways has a huge emotional history for you, so much so that you wouldn't even give it up for your husband. So
that's right.
You know, I wanted to ask you to read another poem, quite different in tone, Little Hat.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I don't know if you want to say anything about it or not.
Well, I think that I do need to say something about Little Hat. In Little Hat, there is a word I usually just define before I read it. I use the word toque, T-O-Q-U-E, which is kind of an antiquated word for an antiquated little hat, a fancy, soft little hat. And I think that's as much as I need to say about it. I think that it's one of the central poems of this book, actually, along with Anyways. Little Hat. 40 years in a round box, a nest of tissue paper, magenta velvet toque, your tasteful feather a moire of navy and green, your finely knotted veil folded and draped just so. Little hat, you were more the idea of hat than hat, actual, functional. Your function to wait in the box for occasion. Your emergence to confirm occasion for anyone who would notice your lustrous silk velvet, your grosgrain hatband with its 2 gold-toothed combs. Little hat, how is it possible there was ever such skill, such time? How, in those years, that century, did you exact such care? Little hat, satin lining, lingering scent of lavender. What if there was ever only so much tenderness in the world? If there is so much tenderness, but no more? What if there is no tenderness to spare, not one thread, one stitch?
I love that poem. And I think one of the things I love about your poetry the most is your love of detail and image, and how the details and the images of something, in this particular case, the hat, widen into something that is universal. You know, the loss of tenderness in the world sort of seen through this hat. I don't know if you want to talk at all about grounding your poems in images or imagery and what that means to you.
Yeah, actually, that's an issue that I care a great deal about in poetry, not just in my own poetry, but in all poetry. I want a poet to give me enough actual physical detail that I feel grounded in a particular place or with a particular person or in some situation that I can recognize, that I can touch almost. And then I want the poet to use that as a base from which to move into something larger and more abstract. And in fact, when I started writing the poem Little Hat, my experience was what it often is when I'm writing a poem, which is I'm saying to myself, for some reason, that object or that image is stuck in my mind's eye. I just want to write down some notes about it, so that I'll remember it. I don't know whether I'll turn it into a poem or not, but my experience with Little Hat was that I just simply wanted to record for my memory that hat that I saw in an antique shop.
Yeah.
And as I was describing the hat, then I was surprised to see the poem take a turn where my description was actually including the century in which that little hat from probably the 1930s was made. So the poem surprised me.
Yeah. Well, who was it? Was it Frost who said, "No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader"? And I think you're wonderful at that, just describing the hard details, the beautiful details of something, and then suddenly you feel something lift and widen. And I wanted to ask you to read a third poem, To My Friend Whose Neighbor Is Trying to Steal Her Cat, also very different in tone.
Okay.
Just idle curiosity, was this a true story?
This was a true story, and in fact,
wonderful.
this poem is also a poem written to someone. Little Hat is written to the hat. This poem is written to my best friend, Ann Bednarski, who in fact did tell me a story about a neighbor trying to steal her cat, and it just amused me as a story. So again, I turned to my notebook to record the story, and the poem has what I think of as a real working title. It gives a lot of information. To my friend whose neighbor is trying to steal her cat. At 6:30 a.m., you stand on your neighbor's lawn, calling your cat, who reclines on the deep porch, black paw and white paw playing with air, who pauses at the sound of his name, who stretches like the limousine of shadow at the foot of the maple. There is no place that Chipper does not live. That is the problem. And the fact that your neighbor will not promise not to feed him. It was fair enough in winter for her to rescue Chipper from the sill of the potting shed that week of storm and wind, the whole world lost in snow. And fair enough weeks later to welcome him back, companion in the garden, visitor for an afternoon. But now it is July. A blue bowl waits by her back door. Last week, you looked in your neighbor's front window and saw your wild cat curled on the couch, positioned before the television. Each day you are late to work because you must wake early, button jeans over your nightgown, and drive 3/4 of a mile to the farmhouse where Chipper goes by another name. You stand at the edge of your neighbor's lawn, calling your cat who spills across the dewy grass. Your cat who owns nothing. Everything.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the image of the limousine that you set up in the beginning. Was that something that was integral to the poem or something that came later? Because it seems like the limousine sets up the power of the cat that happens later on.
You know, Sally, the limousine of shadow was a happy accident.
Yeah,
You know,
it's a beautiful image.
So much of writing for me is a sense of exploring, playing, being open to surprise. And Limousine of Shadow had a nice sound to it, and it seemed
Well, it's a beautiful visual image too.
Visually rather accurate. And I thought, okay, I think the poem can accommodate that.
Well, for me, it was nice foreshadowing. I wanted to ask you to read Temporary Tattoo. I want to make sure that we get to hear as much of you as possible.
Now, Temporary Tattoo
is not in the book.
Not in the book.
I have it.
Oh, you have it.
I have it.
I'm so glad.
I realized a little late, maybe. There we are.
Yeah, Temporary Tattoo will be in my third book. And here it is. Okay, I don't think this needs an introduction,
I don't
really.
either. I think it's wonderful.
Okay. Temporary Tattoo. Beside the cash register in my favorite used bookstore, I see a glass bowl of what seem to be postage stamps until I look closer. Temporary tattoos of red and green with ornate black lettering, bruised apple books. Take one, says Andrew. Take two, as if he directs a film about the struggle of an independent bookseller and his aging clientele, some of them tattooed in the summer of love, some of them tattooed by surgery or time. I take one, although I know a temporary tattoo is oxymoronic, maybe just plain moronic, something else the world does not need, as no one needs the leather-bound collected Thackeray, or the first edition Joy of Sex inscribed, Love, from guess who? A tattoo should be permanent, a commitment, a cross-hatched cobra coiled around the biceps, inks of deep blue and green like the veins that pop from the carny's arm when he makes a fist. A tattoo should not smear, dissolve with baby oil on tissue, should be bold as a snake swallowing a mouse and the mouse shape traveling the length of it like a bad idea shaping a life, distorting a life. The apple is pink-red, like the tip of a cigarette. Its single leaf the green of the 1964 Chevy convertible on cinder blocks behind the bookstore. A car that will never run, despite the young man who works under the hood every night until dark. Someone should go to him and tell him the sum is not always greater than its parts. Sometimes the parts are what is valuable, what can be parlayed into a life. Tell him, sell the tires, sell the wheels. Tell him there is not enough light in all of his days to spend evenings with his back to the stars, staining his hands with grease and oil. Someone should give him the tattoo of the bruised apple, which will last a week at best. Tell him the Chevy's time has come and gone, that nothing lasts forever except our desire for things to last forever. But he is too young to know this, and nothing can convince him this is true. Nothing written in any of these books can show him what his strong hands seem to show as they fold the oily rag and drop the hood on another day, and in the gravel lot behind the bookstore, the last of the sun shines, pink, and everywhere, and always.
I love that poem. I love the way that poem moves, and particularly the lines, which are so hard to get away with in a poem without sounding something. Nothing lasts but our desire for things to last forever. I'm ruining it a little bit, but it's a beautiful, beautiful line.
Well, you know, if I could just jump in to say, I love to read poems where I think the poet includes something that may not work or almost doesn't work.
Yeah.
To me, that's an exciting kind of risk. And so it's exciting for me to, you know, hear you say, well, gee, that line is
It
awfully
just feels
close
integral
to cliche.
and true.
Yeah.
Integral and true. You know, it's beautiful in the way you move from, you know, the tattoo to the man in the back who's working on the car. Just the movement in the poem is stunning. Right? My grandfather meets FDR.
Okay, it's just in the book.
I love that your book has a lot of your family's history, but has also a lot of the country's history.
You know, I don't think of myself as someone who writes poems about my family. I often think of myself as someone who writes about history and place, but my family members do show up, and this
Well, they're the particulars.
they are the particulars. And I would say for the record that this poem is actually based on an exercise that I've given my students often, which is write a poem about someone you know meeting a famous person.
I might steal that assignment.
It's a lot of fun. They have fun with it, and I had fun with it in this poem, which I think there's a grain of truth in it, but I'm not sure. The poem is called My Grandfather Meets FDR. Once he crossed the ocean and took the train north and walked through town to the address he'd folded into his pocket back in Petrovavest, and once he'd shaken his brother's hand and carried his suitcase to the room at the top of the stairs and changed his shirt and followed his brother to the shoe factory, my grandfather saw no reason to travel ever again. But one Sunday, FDR's train, headed elsewhere, was scheduled to stop. My grandfather and his brother Stephen, after church, in dress shirts and dark hats, walked to the edge of town. My grandfather, who never in my lifetime voted for anyone, who told me, they're all crooks, all of them are crooks, my grandfather stood in the sun in his best shirt. He stood in the crowd as if he wanted entirely to stand there, and on his day off, wearing his starched collar as if he expected any moment to be lifted up into heaven. What did my grandfather want of the earth? I think he wanted little more than food, enough food, maybe a fish he'd caught himself. One of the fish he'd be fishing for if he weren't standing here, waiting for a rich man who swam in a cold lake and never walked again. My grandfather collected photographs of this man, for whom he would take off his hat, who in turn would take off his hat as the sun poured down on them both. Call it a meeting, though it was only their eyes that met. Call it the prime of one man's life, and he the one who stayed behind.
It's just how either you or I would feel if George Bush was driving by, right? Anyway, it's a lovely poem, especially in light of the political situation right now. We only have about 3 or 4 more minutes, so I wanted to ask you to read Milton Kessler's poem.
Oh. Well, this poem...
The Evolving Sensibility poem.
That's right. In fact, this poem is also from my dear friend Ann Bednarski. It's about being at a poetry reading with Ann when we were both teenagers. And on one hand, this is about misbehaving at a poetry reading. I've only done that once, and here it is. Milton Kessler was a wonderful poet, a wonderful teacher at SUNY Binghamton. That's the Milton Kessler of this poem. Milton Kessler's poem. Last night, as I turned the last corner toward home, there it was, the moon, round as a platter, silvery white, and I couldn't help but think of that poet reciting the line we thought so bad, raising his arm along with his voice, "Oh boy, look at that moon." And we, 16 years old, catching each other's eye and laughing into our hands, not understanding the line was supposed to be bad, was crafted to show how short language falls in the light of the living moment. At the edge of the woods, that moment I turned from Pine Street to Elm, there it stared, the moon, a marvel above the hills and rooftops and snowy yards. It was the biggest thing in the city and the most important. And I know the moon's light is sunlight that only it can see. But it occurred to me last night that maybe the moon remembers the sun, her distant partner, so intensely it is memory that shines from her. It is memory that turns the snow pale blue and sparkles along the river, memory that illumines night. Under the full moon I could see deer tracks like black stones set on the snow as if to show someone the way back home, and so I thought of you, Anne, living not far from where we grew up. The deer tracks and the moon sent me back, and, okay, like magic or something, I was sitting beside you in the college conference room, a man reading his new handwritten poem, although he knew the chances were not good that anyone there would ever remember it, not even one line, although he certainly knew that some of us did not understand what we were hearing and might never. But he read it anyway, slowly and with care, on his face a slight smile that should have told us he wanted us to laugh when he said, "Oh boy, look at that moon." He wanted us to laugh out loud at that moment when the poem stepped out of itself and into us.
Yeah, I love that. As your last poem, would you read Airstream?
Airstream. There's Airstream. Okay. Airstream.
Do you want to say anything?
I think I just need to say that Airstream is in fact that silver Airstream trailer. That image may have popped into your mind. That's this this Airstream, and there's an epigraph to this poem from Handel's Messiah, which is also from 1 Corinthians in the Bible. The epigraph reads, "We shall all be changed." Airstream. The broad aluminum expanse of you, back corners rounded like a horse's rump, front corners rounded like a horse's rump, your narrow back door with its screen and latch handle, your tiny, purposely inadequate windows. What part of you, Airstream, does not speak? What part of you does not promise elsewhere, promise that we can be taken far from here? We can pack our hat, a change of clothes, maybe a set of watercolors, maybe a book. That, you promise, is all we need. We can drive until we find the spot of our dreams, the lake, the willow tree, beside which we will park you, unfold your three-step staircase and carry out our card table and folding chairs, our sandwiches, and it will be like the ancient Chinese drawing, horse and willow tree in the moonlight. You, Airstream, the little horse, bending to the blank space that reads as grass, because there are two blades of grass in the foreground. Or maybe the horse feeds on the empty space. The emptiness is enough to feed him, enough. Or is it the moonlight that feeds him, the moment itself? You, Airstream, being the horse, could explain this to us. We who always want more, who always want change, yet fear change. We who cannot find the moment, let alone feed from it. But there by the lake, finally, we would have no desire to be elsewhere. Airstream, even here, tethered as you are behind a garage, the front of you supported by cinder blocks and stained plywood, reflecting what is near, you shimmer. Would it be too much, Airstream, to say you sing? Your song is of the maple, here with you beside the garbage cans, its leaves flickering in the breeze. Your song is of the ladder left leaning against the garage, of the forgotten orange work gloves. These are not the songs we want to sing, Airstream, but you promise we shall all be changed.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful metamorphosis poem. I'm afraid we have to wrap up, but I want to thank you, Suzanne, and thank you for watching Poetry Break.
Thanks for having me.